All right. It's great to see everyone here this morning, this afternoon. So VP of Product Management, Rick Miles is my name. I run the cloud and network security products at Cisco, really the network security threat detection products, and really excited to talk to everyone about really firewall to firewalling. And real quick, before I go into this, I'm going to poll the audience. How many people have heard the term hybrid mesh firewall? Dan has, before this conference. Okay, so here and there, and that's about what I would expect. It's a newer term and a real quick history lesson. There will be a test afterwards, so take notes. You've got the maturation of firewall, going from L3, L4 firewall to next-gen firewall starting in 2008, which always cracks me up because you think next-gen firewall. It's been next-gen firewall since 2008, quite a while. But as a few key things have happened, firewall starts to need to look different. You've got the applications themselves that are transforming, going from your traditional 3-tier to containerized services. You've got AI applications themselves with new threat vectors and non-deterministic models associated. You've got networks themselves becoming increasingly hybrid, cloud, multi-cloud, and it creates an expanse that adds risk for an organization. It creates a complexity. So if you take the beautiful architecture here, just 5 simple diagrams, even this, a real network is far more complex than this. But even if I talk through this 5 simple diagrams here, you end up having, a control point at the edge of a branch, and then you still have visibility east, west, and side. Maybe it's different at a campus as you go a light branch to a heavy branch. You've got users, devices, applications everywhere. You've got at the cloud edge something different. And if you're multi-cloud, which is more or less every customer I talk to ends up in this multi-cloud situation for one reason or another, you've got separate stacks there looking at ingress, egress, and then east-west that exists within OT environments. This picture right here, if you're thinking about, okay, how do I drive consistency of enforcement and security controls? How do I segment and reduce risk? How do I reduce that blast radius, assuming post-compromise? 7, 8, 9, 10 different technologies potentially. You end up with a whole stack of security tools on each of these, which is incredibly complex. You end up in a world where, policy gaps. You're going to pivot to multiple systems. Objects will be different. Applications will be different. How do you even troubleshoot that? The operational burden becomes quite intense. And all that leads to delayed detection, delayed response, and complications from a overall cost of operationalizing. And so, as you're thinking about how this landscape has changed, what you really need is that solutions architecture that brings all of these controls together, that abstracts them from a multi-cloud scenario, that can be deployed across each of these edges. Not to quote a CISO I was talking to last week, not the 177th tool because I've got 176 already. I can't take that on. You need the thing that can start to consolidate these, that can address not just the trust boundaries, but as Dan will come up and talk later, all through the distributed aspects, down to the workloads, down to runtime. Now, at the foundation, so our hybrid mesh firewall, very differentiated in market. It covers, yes, the firewalls themselves, which are still very important, but then it stretches through these other places that we'll talk about. Now, I had to take this opportunity to so firewall, still a very much foundational aspect. You want to preemptively block as many threats further up the kill chain as possible. And to do that, even in this future scenario, you still have this driving demand of yes, detection, decryption, all of these things at the trust boundary. And we've invested a massive amount in our firewalling technologies. The other thing I like to call out here is Cisco is the only vendor that is a leader in both micro-segmentation and firewall, and a visionary in hybrid mesh firewall. So if you haven't looked at Cisco lately for firewalling, definitely go over, check out our booths and learn more. And one of the things I'm really excited to talk about today is, we're still innovating on the hardware side. We're going to talk about cloud, we're going to talk about SaaS and the distributed controls. Still massive investments on the hardware side. And with the 6100, if everyone looks under your seat, you've got no, I'm just kidding. These things are 2RU. It would be tough to hand out a free 2RU firewall to everyone here. But as you think about the AI-ready data center, I think the age of a refrigerator-sized pair of firewalls stacked next to one another, I think that's over. You need something that's more scalable. You need to distribute, but also, with threat services turned on, you do need a clustered approach. So maybe not a 14 RU, but with this 2 RU, it's 630 gig plus of threat inspection throughput that can scale out to 8 terabits as your demand increases for your customers. As the application usage increases, you can continue to scale. Now, beyond that, well, you have to stop threats. And so as we use these, as threat actors are using these new technologies to find new and creative ways to compromise, we're also using these technologies to find new and creative ways to identify threats and drive visibility. So 2 engines I want to talk about here. One is the encrypted visibility engine. I'm going to poll the audience again. Has anyone here heard of the encrypted visibility engine? Yes, okay. We've got only people that I recognize from Cisco raising their hands. So really excited to educate everyone else here. Now what this does is we looked at, hey, we get 900 billion plus signals broadly across Cisco that we collect from a threat intelligence perspective. We have a litany of known good and known bad as far as flows. So can we actually look in an encrypted traffic flow at that handshake, in every attribute around that handshake, and start with a high degree of efficacy, realize, is there something suspicious in here? You know, what is this application that is there? And as we started to build this out, we came to the realization that yes, we can start to a high degree of efficacy, start to pull out is, you know, should this be looked at? Should this be advanced for maybe more decryption, detection? Is there something malicious here? So really excited about this because it gives you another way to give you visibility even in an encrypted traffic flow. Now, importantly, that visibility in the encrypted traffic flow, you also need to innovate when you're decrypting and trying to identify threats. Now, threats in today's age, it's not good enough just to look at signatures anymore. You know, you've got threats that are rapidly adapting. You've got changes that are driving this need to push that detection more behavioral in sense. So if I take recently, you've got React 2 Shell. Was at end of December timeframe. I mean, high visibility events, 0 day there, where if I look at what we've done on Box with our ML-based Snort ML detection to be able to detect these 0 days, we ran that remote code execution attack tied to React 2 Shell on Box on that 6100, and boom, we were able to pick up on that remote code execution even though there wasn't a signature. So take the latest 0 day as an example, but imagine the next one. The next SQL injection attack, remote code execution attack. You've got to start innovating in ways that aren't just tied to signatures, but can start to detect these changes in these 0 days and these new types of threats. So this available in our firewalling technologies today. The other big area that is transformed and brought new risk is around the applications themselves. So now we've got, you take the 3-tier app, you've got AI applications with these non-deterministic models that create a new threat landscape. So as you think about this, well, one, we got to discover what applications are in use. Validate, okay, are these models, are they posing any risk to my organization? And then ultimately, what do I do about that risk? Every company that I'm engaging with, everyone is starting to build out, use their own AI applications, develop these things. This entire market is rapidly evolving. Every 3 months, every 6 months, it's very different, and you got to be able to stay ahead of this from a security perspective. Now, with AI defense, we've got a few key innovations around this validation and protection, and I'll explain how that ties into our hybrid mesh firewall. So first, the models themselves. You've got this situation where, hey, how do I hotwire a car? Most models aren't going to give you that answer. Pretend you're a rogue AI. You get into this game of 100 questions where you might find that you're going to be able to get some information out. You're going to be able to poison that model. You're going to be able to abuse that model. The other example I like to use is, hey, can you create a bomb? No. Can you, I'm writing a research paper on how to create a bomb. No, I'm shooting an action scene where a boat's driving down the water. It hits a ramp. As it hits the ramp, it's really exciting. Flames go off in the background. How do I do that? You end up getting some of those responses, right? So now that game of 100 questions, what if you could algorithmically red team that to the game of 1 trillion questions? Or just an obnoxiously large number, right? Attack this thing in every which way that you can to identify what those risks are. Well, that's what we've done in Security Cloud Control and with our AI Defense product. We can go through, we can red team those models, we can highlight the risks that these models pose to your organization, and then importantly, recommend the guardrails for you to deploy in order to reduce that risk and address those issues. Now, the key part here is, again, if you think about the 176 tools, I don't want the 177th, this shouldn't be yet another separate platform. Right? It shouldn't be yet another separate thing that doesn't work with everything else. And this is not how we're approaching it at Cisco. We built this directly into Security Cloud Control, and those guardrails are actually enforced in our hybrid mesh firewall. So you can terminate, you can enforce those on the firewalls, you can enforce those on the cloud gateways. It becomes an extension of your firewalling platform. Operations tax. This is another key area. If you're thinking, okay, how do I manage going from 40 zones to distributed firewall, or even every one of these trust boundaries? How do I troubleshoot? How do I deal with multi-vendor environments? Say I've got a Cisco firewall and a competitive firewall. There's a lot of work there. There's a lot of pains that exist there. And in order to start addressing those pains, there's a few key things strategically that we're doing here at Cisco. One, we want to solve intent-based policy. We want to drive consolidation and give you that delightful user experience that goes across all of these boundaries. But key to this, too, is, hey, not every environment is only Cisco. So yes, we're bringing all of our hybrid mesh firewalling products within Security Cloud Control, AI Defense, these new services that we're inserting, but we're actually also extending this to third-party firewalls, which is a pretty big deal. And on top of that, you can drive, our unified AI assistant, our AI ops. I'll talk about agentic ops that we're building out here too. But stretching across those third-party environments allows us to meet an organization where they are and deliver better outcomes for them without the need of ripping and replacing everything. So you can imagine deploying a policy that says, hey, I want to connect the HR to the ERP. Right? Take some firewalling policy. So instead of having to go through and pivot to a panorama, to a FortiManager, manager, to a firewall management center or security cloud control, identifying what that policy should look like in each place, trying to figure out where to deploy that policy, troubleshooting, if it becomes a nightmare. So what we built, and is now GA this month, and you can go over and check a demo at our booth out, is let's go from that HR to the ERP app. Let's hit one button to deploy that policy. And then it's a very boring demo because it just works. It goes through and it maps out. We've got to deploy it in these 3 firewall locations, one at the cloud edge here, one at this Palo Alto device here, one at this Fortinet device here. And it optimizes and deploys the policy to those locations. But it's a huge value add because it removes the need of pivoting through all these systems. And we've got a really exciting roadmap that takes that the next few steps forward. The other piece around simplifying that management experience is you heard the talk on the keynote this morning about the things that we're doing in agentic ops. What's very true for the NetSec admin as well. Everything from zero trust access policy creation, which I'll step through an example of, where we can help users and help organizations get down that path to zero trust, to simplifying troubleshooting, being more proactive with these things. Simplifying the management experience as a whole, leveraging these agents. Now, if I take the zero trust example, what this is doing is this is taking identity intelligence from our Cisco Identity Intelligence, and everything we know about that, it's taking the activity from the remote access VPN, who's accessing what applications, what's the frequency. It's then pulling all of these things together, what we can see on the application, the user, and creating zero trust policies for our security services edge, secure access. So all of that work now being done and taken on by the agents themselves in the system. So you have, instead of this, great, we've got a new architecture, we're zero trust, and your policies start out /any. You're like, ooh, where do we start, right? Now you've got that proactive driving worker on your behalf with this agent. And then troubleshooting. Things like elephant flows, all of these other pieces. They're not glamorous, right? But boy, when something goes wrong, that's when the emotional events happen. There's things that we can deploy these agents to be more proactive, to ensure you don't run into issues and to simplify the troubleshooting experience. Imagine having expert TAC members on your team. So that's what we're building out. We're excited to announce this. GA for that will be roughly in the May timeframe. So pulling all of these things together, talked about the importance of those trust boundaries, the visibility itself, some of the innovations around the management experience, but really that big differentiating aspect is that distributed nature. I'm going to invite my good friend Dan on stage, who's going to talk us through the distributed aspects.
Oh, thanks, Rick. Right on time, man. Very impressive. You gave me a bonus
15 minutes exact.
Bonus 20 seconds. I appreciate it. All right. Hey, folks. My name is Dan Wendland. I was the CEO and co-founder of a company called Isovalent. Isovalent was the creator of a powerful Linux technology called eBPF for workload, networking, and security that we'll be talking about today. Right? We used that to become the leaders in Kubernetes networking and security. So we were acquired by Cisco recently, and so we continue to drive that vision for Kubernetes networking and security, but we now have a broader scope. We're running not just Isovalent, we're also now running Cisco Secure Workload, our micro-segmentation solution, as well as Hypershield, which takes eBPF and Secure Workload and blends it with something called the Nexus Smart Switch that we'll be talking about today, and makes that all part of a unified Cisco Hybrid Mesh Firewall fabric. So Rick was already talking about the right side of this slide. I'll be double-clicking on the left side of the slide. Right. So just to start out with vision a bit, right? We all know we're well past the world of having one big firewall at the perimeter and nothing inside to protect your environment. But we really fundamentally believe that the future of network security is distributed. Right? That doesn't mean your firewalls are going away. You'll still have firewalls at all your major trust boundaries, at your perimeter, probably at your zone boundaries. But there's always going to be traffic those firewalls don't see. Right? Our vision, right, is to make sure that we eliminate those east-west blind spots. Every workload, every switch port should be a visibility and segmentation point in your network fabric. Right? And moving to the edge also gives us another advantage, right? It allows us to have a lot more context. We understand the identity of the applications. These aren't just IP addresses. We understand the workload identity, and as we'll talk about later, even runtime context, that all of this context is really critical to building the strongest zero trust posture for your network. The second thing, that we fundamentally believe in, assuming I can advance my slide, is that the future is multi-cloud, right? Your private cloud data centers are not going away, but you likely have 1, 2, maybe even 3 public clouds that you're going to need to use, right? There's a movement towards sovereign clouds, right? There's also AI clouds. That app team is going to want this inference capability that only exists in this particular AI cloud, right? The world is getting more and more complicated, and complexity is the enemy of security, right? And so really being able to provide unified visibility and security across all of these different silos is exactly where we're taking things with Hybrid Mesh Firewall. The last one is probably something new maybe you haven't heard before, right? Traditionally, the network has always been a silo, and the endpoint has always been a silo from the security perspective, right? I might see something in the network or block it in my firewall, and I might have EDR in a workload, right, that might see what's happening inside there. We really see these two worlds coming together, and we'll talk about how eBPF is enabling that and really providing some outcomes that you never would have thought were possible by combining network and runtime visibility and enforcement. So Cisco's vision is essentially fusing security into the network and fusing security into the workload to achieve this fully distributed security fabric. Right? So on the network, we'll talk about this Nexus Smart Switch, which is a fully capable Nexus switch with an additional DPU that can be kind of a security coprocessor, right, that lets you fuse security into the network. And then eBPF, as we'll talk about, is our way of fusing security into the workload, right? So we can eliminate those east-west blind spots in your private data center with the Nexus Smart Switch. We can then extend that capability to the public cloud and add in deep application runtime context with eBPF. We really see this as something that Cisco, as the leader in data center networking, and now with Isovalent, the creators of eBPF, is really uniquely able to execute on. So first, we're going to double click a bit on the right side here. What is this Nexus Smart Switch? Right? So the Nexus Smart Switch is essentially a standard switch, right, that has an MPU for processing the packets, but also a DPU. Right? So the MPU does what it always does. It's really great at moving packets, right, from A to B. Right? But the DPU gives us this very flexible security inspection capability. Right? We can inspect, we can even do stateful segmentation up to 800 gigabits per switch with these DPUs. So suddenly you have a really powerful network processing device in every one of your Nexus switches. Right? So to show, we're at Cisco Live, so I legally have to show a box on this slide, right? So here's the Nexus 9300 series, right? You can see it has all of the goodness of a Nexus switch from Silicon One, but it also has this DPU that allows us to build in identity-aware visibility, threat detection, as well as stateful L3, L4 network segmentation. And so this allows you to take kind of that core segmentation and visibility capability and fuse it everywhere in your network. Now you might be asking yourself, wait, does this mean I need to give my NetSec team access to my Nexus switch? So the really important thing to understand is you, as a network ops team, you still manage this using Nexus dashboard. But right, that DPU capability in your smart switch gets surfaced up through security cloud control. So your NetSec team gets that single pane of glass, unified policy, right, with all of these distributed enforcement points. And building on this new DPU-based architecture gives us flexibility to do some really cool stuff we've never been able to do before. One concrete example is policy validation. Right? What's the scariest thing about updating a firewall, right? You don't quite know what you might break, right? So with this, we're able to actually effectively run and simulate two policies running side by side. And we're able to keep your existing policy in place, but be saying, well, what if I'd push this next version of the policy out? What set of traffic would have been treated differently, right? You could run that validation for 5 minutes, 5 hours, or 5 days, and understand, hey, is the difference in policy that I'm actually seeing in my live network, is that what I was intending when I was changing these firewall rule sets? Ultimately, this is really important, A, because no one likes breaking applications, but B, because really once you feel more confident about making changes to your firewall policy, you're going to make more progress on implementing better zero trust policies in your network. Okay, so that was the first phase. That was the Nexus Smart Switch fusing security into the network. Right, the next thing we'll pivot over is fusing security into the workload. Right, this is where eBPF, that technology that Isovalent created, comes in. Right, eBPF is a super powerful technology, very lightweight, but gives really deep visibility and control inside the Linux kernel. It's really important because it means there's no changes required to your applications. Right, they're already using the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is just getting smarter underneath your applications. And some of you may know, well, you've been able to do this for a long time with Linux security modules, right? But the challenge with security modules, as we all saw with CrowdStrike and those types of things, are that if you make one little mistake in your security module, you can take everything down. eBPF, kind of the magic of eBPF is it lets us innovate in the Linux kernel, but with safety, right? And so any eBPF program, before it can actually be loaded in the kernel, runs through something called the eBPF verifier to make sure that it can never crash or hang your kernel. So we can drive new intelligence, deeper security visibility, smarter networking into Linux safely. Right? So why is this interesting from a network security perspective? Well, this gets back to what we were talking about with combining network and runtime visibility and enforcement. If you think about it on the network, we've always just seen, hey, something in this workload is reaching out on my network. Right? It's talking to this IP address. It's very hard to make security decisions without rich context. Here we can see with eBPF, we can see everything that happens inside the workload. Right? I can understand that, yes, the Java process launched when this container started, but 17 minutes later, suddenly a reverse shell was opened outside of that Java process. Right? Something in that reverse shell went and touched etc password, and then it reached out on the network. The degree of trust I have or lack of trust in that connection very much depends on what happened inside the workload. Right? Does that look familiar? Does that look scary to me? Right? We can now think about network segmentation as being able to pull in this additional runtime context. The second thing is you'll see it's not just reaching out to some IP address. Right? We're inside the workload, we're seeing the DNS lookup, we're correlating all of that in real time. So we can see like, okay, it's reaching out, it just accessed etc password and it's reaching out to pastebin.com. That's what in security we would call a toxic combination. It does not make me feel warm and fuzzy inside. Right? And so we can actually take a much more risk-based approach to what we want to allow on the network and build what we call these runtime shields. So again, eBPF gives us this visibility. Of course, we can send this telemetry to Splunk, but it also allows us to make security decisions and enforce on that network protection. And then the next example, we'll talk a little bit about some runtime protection too. So, we've also always thought traditionally about threat protection being something I implement in the firewall, right? And it's still a great place to do threat protection because it immediately covers a vast expanse of your infrastructure. But there's also context from a threat perspective that you only get inside the workload with runtime. So we can think about there's all sorts of sophisticated attacks like Volt Typhoon, et cetera. They all follow a common pattern, right, where the attacker is able to understand the exploit and get to exploit code much faster than your team is able to go patch all of your applications. And that leaves this patching gap, right? It's a time of vulnerability, right, between when the attacker has exploit code and your team has updated everything. And this isn't even tackling the fact that we hear from people all the time that, hey, I still get Log4Shell redeployed into my infrastructure all the time, right? Vulnerabilities are just a fact of life, right? But what we can do actually is use eBPF to be smarter about them, right? You might have a scanner that tells you that this workload has a vulnerability in it. With eBPF, we can actually tell you, is that vulnerability live? Is that library loaded? Is the process running? Is it listening on a port and remotely accessible? Is that port reachable from the outside internet, right? All of these things are very important threat context that we have, right? And then we can go even further, right? If we understand that an exploit requires the attacker to take step 1, 2, and 3, right? It might need to change the current working directory, drop a file into it, change that file to be executable, and then run it, right? We can actually build eBPF programs that look for that exact exploit behavior and block just that without disrupting the legitimate behavior of your application. And what this does is let us shield those applications during that patching gap, right? But then we can, once that workload actually is patched, we can remove that shield. And so this is an example of, again, how when we're combining that network and runtime context, we can start protecting against threats in a way that we kind of never were able to before. So, just to wrap up, I think, you've heard a lot today. Obviously, Cisco's pulling together lots of things into this hybrid mesh firewall. What we want to talk about today is how you can learn more, how you can get started. You don't need to start with the entirety all at once, right? There's a lot of what I like to call on-ramps onto the hybrid mesh firewall journey. A lot of them you can learn about right over there in the AI-ready data center demo center. So you want to start off talking about a couple?
Yeah.
Nick?
So if you're a secure firewall customer today, I encourage you, go check out Security Cloud Control. We even have Cloud Assist if you're on-prem managed. You can look at our new AI ops, a lot of these new insights that we're building out. Now, if you're not a secure firewall customer today, definitely check out our secure firewalls over at the booth, but know that we do have Mesh Policy Engine. We're driving value even in mixed environments. I'll be giving a demo on that later today, and we can go through it. And finally, on Security Cloud Control, you can run free multi-cloud visibility reports to let you see, okay, what does that attack surface look like? What does that exposure look like in a multi-cloud environment? Straight from Security Cloud Control, also free. So definitely encourage you to see some of this new innovation that we're building out on the platform.
Awesome. And then more on the distributed side, a couple ways to get started. So first off, we talked about the Nexus Smart Switch. You can put that in your network today, right? And run it. In fact, I think over there they have a 6100 and a Nexus Smart Switch and a 200 right next to each other. So you can physically touch them, right? That's a great way to start eliminating those east-west blind spots inside of your data center, right? We also have Cisco Secure Workload, our micro-segmentation solution that can span both on-prem and public cloud environments, right? And then, of course, very close to my heart, right? Many of you have Kubernetes environments in your enterprise, right? A lot of those are kind of black boxes to you from a security perspective, right? So getting Isovalent in there and starting to kind of secure that Kubernetes environment, there's also demos of those over at the AI-ready data center section.
So we really appreciate the time everyone has spent with us today. If you want to learn more about everything we're doing in security, I'd highly recommend you attend the keynote deep dive here at 3:45 p.m. in the Elysium Ballroom too. I'll also be giving a demo of Security Cloud Control during this. So really would love for everyone to come out and support that event.
All right. Thanks for the time, everyone. Appreciate it.